All right, good. Well, welcome everybody on this late summer afternoon. Thanks for coming to the governance workshop. We have as always, there's an agenda in the voice chat, and as always, you're free to just follow along. No need to look, but if you want to look, great. Um, so yeah, as usual, we're going to start talking about things that are in process, and then we're going to expand into a discussion of voting and proposals, and just generally brainstorming on some steps of the process that we're still trying to firm up and would really love to get some community thoughts on. So in terms of where things are now on the forum, we have several Treasury proposals, which if you haven't gone to take a look at, please go take a look. We would welcome more comments on those. I know that two of them are with the SOFONs right now, the Treasury Charter and the Bancorp proposal. And we're hoping to get the other ones with them soon. So keep an eye out for that. We also have our draft about formats, categories, templates. We've had some really good conversation that came out of Treasury Tuesday yesterday that's leading us to think a little differently about some of the templates in terms of how we talk about teams. So thank you, Aya, for that. In terms of what's upcoming, there are three process KIPs that are making their way through internal working groups. So we've got one on the overall process, one on the SOFON framework, and one on SOFON onboarding and offboarding, and the latter has definitely benefited from the conversation we had a couple weeks ago. So thank you everybody for that, and actually all of them have. I was going back and looking at some slides from earlier sessions, and we've actually covered a lot of the ground that's gone into these KIPs. So I'm really grateful to the community for that. In terms of external, we still have our, I think, Starfire or Matt, let me know if I'm wrong, but we still have our proposal up at Optimism. So that, go take a look. It's linked in the agenda if you haven't. And please express some support. That would be a big help. Anything else in terms of things that are currently in process? One other thing, it's not mentioned here, but in case anybody hasn't seen, we are moving Treasury Tuesday as well to every other week. So now this and Treasury Tuesday will be bi-weekly meetings. I think that's the right use of the term, bi-weekly, every other week. And we've got some other meetings as well that we're figuring out. So look forward to that. We had a great community call. Was it last week? Oh my gosh. Yeah, community office hours. So we'll be having more of those, and also our Friday updates. So we're working hard to get more information in the community however we can. Yeah, so that's kind of the status update. In terms of current events, what's happening in Rook in the ecosystem, this Lido governance vote has been weighing on my mind and has been really, I think, topical for us at Rook in particular, given some things that happened with our voting recently and with our vote last week. And so I wanted to start there. In case people aren't familiar with it, there's some documentation of what went on in the agenda, but just a quick recap. Lido had a governance vote where it was a Treasury diversification proposal that was put forward either by Dragonfly Capital or someone else. Those parts aren't as important as the fact that it boiled down to something where the community had a lot of discussion around the idea. The community seemed to go in one direction, and then at one point, one whale stepped in and voted somewhat counter to what the community was voting. And then at the last second, an even larger whale came in and voted with the community, which is something I know we haven't seen that kind of drama in our own voting, of course, but we've seen, as every DAO that has token holder voting has seen, whales have started playing a serious role in terms of our outcomes. And so what I wanted to do is open the floor to start talking about how we might think about working with that, what it might mean. And so before we do that, given that we have a lot of new people here, this might be excess information, but I thought it might be helpful because our voting process is so complicated, and so not so complicated, it's not actually, but it looks complicated if you haven't been through it before. So what I wanted to do was talk you all through how it works in terms of what we do before we start talking about how we might address some of these things. All right, so there you should be able to see, this is just sort of setting the table. If we think about our process as having these 4 big steps, you develop this is very rough, but you develop an idea, you develop a proposal, refine the proposal in the forum, Then it goes to the SOFONs who make a recommendation and who vote, and then token holders vote on snapshot. And then there's this mysterious thing called reconciliation. So let's unpack this for people who are new to Rook. So what we're really interested in, I think, or what I'm really interested in talking today about is how we get from this stage where the SOFONs recommend and the token holders vote to reconciliation, right? So in our process, it's evolved a bit, but as things currently stand, once something is taken on by the SOFONs make a recommendation of whether they object or have no objection. And then the token holders vote, having the benefit of the SOFON's recommendation, and the token holders then vote objection versus no objection. And so you can see there are 4 possible outcomes here, right? And there are 2 that are very obvious. When the SOFONs and the token holders move in the same direction, then we either, all things equal, we either adopt or we choose not to move forward with a proposal. But the question obviously comes in, what happens if they disagree, right? So if they disagree, at the moment we go to reconciliation, which is a process where the SOFONs and the community and the objecting token holders try to reach consensus. And so let's bracket that for a moment, because that's a whole process that perhaps we can talk about in a couple of weeks. But my question is, how do we know what is meaningful disagreement and how do we measure this? And the reason I'm bringing this up is we did have a whale who voted on KIP 26 who amounted to 10% of the vote. Who voted against it was this, and yet they were the only objector, right? So as we think about rules for moving into reconciliation, at the moment we're pretty subjective about it, and it's a SOFON decision, and it seems like it might be better to have a more rule-based way of approaching it. And so one of the things we've been thinking about is if we set a token holder quorum, and obviously we have to figure out what the quorum is, and that's very tricky, but we could resolve this to a set of outcomes where if the SOFONs, as it is now, if they recommend in a certain direction, if a quorum of the token holders vote with the SOFONs, then we move forward. And if a quorum of them vote against, then we go into reconciliation. Right? Are people with me so far? Okay. Well, moving forward. So then the question is, what does a quorum look like? And you can sort of look around the space and you can see they generally have some combination of some percent of all the possible tokens that could be voted, some percent of the tokens that were voted in the election. And you can also imagine some number of wallets voted to avoid the single whale problem. But with that, I want to open it up and hear what other people think. Like, does the quorum idea resonate? Do these measures sound like they're a way to go? How do people feel about a single objector versus multiple objectors?
I would just say that number of wallets that voted could be gamed pretty easily.
Yep. Yeah, that's fair. Oh, that's a really good point. Thank you. So one of the things we've been talking about is right now, as it stands, we don't really have a way of knowing in the reconciliation process whether someone who's expressing objections was the one who voted for the objections. So we're looking at having some way of having people sign, when they object and they vote to object, that they would sign that objection in a comment to the community, either on the forum or on Discord. We'll figure out. We haven't, really looked at the application yet, but some way of linking people's objections to their votes, which doesn't fully address what you're raising, but would hopefully address part of it.
But I think that would be kind of essential, actually. We need to do that. So.
Yeah. Yeah, so I show recommended. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I think I just spoke over somebody.
That was Aya. So once again, pardon me for not being as informed as I should be to be taking up the space. But I'm curious if that voter actually had reasons for the objection, which to me is always good information to be looking at and taking in.
Yep.
And I'm curious if that voter's votes were from just Rook holdings or from X Rook holdings or both.
Yeah. So what would the difference be?
So I'm probably in the minority view, although I know I'm not sole one. I definitely don't think X Rook holders and Rook holders should have the same weight of votes based on token holdings. And it's because, to my knowledge of the history, Rook holders either purchased in the open market or are users. But I think to assume that all users have alignment with the interests of the DAO is a really big assumption. So it's not that I don't think Rook holders should have no vote. I just think not having shown any uh, verifiable incentive alignment at all, that they shouldn't have the same weight as X Rook holders.
Just so you know, they did have XRook. They had started purchasing Rook and then staked it, and then after the vote, they started unstaking it and sold a lot of it. But at the time of the vote, it was XRook.
So I know you guys can't do this, but this is where I had the idea from a week or two ago around, even for that XRook incentive alignment, putting weight on the amount of time it's been staked, which can still be gamed, but definitely makes people make a bigger commitment to trying to possibly influence the whole DAO just through being resource rich.
Yeah. No, I'm actually really glad you brought that up because that was one of the things we're going to come back to in terms of how much we weight XRook, because that's now a community decision. So if we bracket the XRook question, because it seems like something we could address with changing the weight of XRook, right, rather than changing the percent of tokens. Well, yeah, that would come back.
From what was just said in this case, it doesn't sound like it would have made a difference.
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't.
Yeah, since we don't lock up XRook, I mean, you've got that small 0.6% or whatever when you deposit. But since it's not locked up, it is super easy to just, stake it and then you have it. So, yeah, no, if we had some sort of locking mechanism that we decide to do, then you could do it. But as long as there's such a minor fee, I mean, they lost more by buying and selling and the slippage and everything than they did from depositing it into the contract and then pulling it out.
So one question is, can you not tell at all when somebody staked? Because even if you didn't do stages, you could at least say somebody has to have staked their XRook for a certain amount of time before their XRook vote counted as full XRook votes. If you can see what
Ideally, yeah, no, this is a great point, and you have been very consistent about this, and I appreciate that because I ended up talking to the people who set up our XRook voting, and their take on it was the way our staking is structured right now, it's not really feasible, but it's something we want to factor in going forward for sure. So yeah, how do people feel about this one wallet versus multiple wallets? Because I'm kind of an absolutist on that, so I want to check my own tendencies here. But it seems like one wallet, there's one school of thought where you can just say a vote is a vote. And there's another school of thought where you could say, well, that's still just one single voter.
So if you try and do it on wallet, it's just way too easy to Sybil attack. If you attach it to some kind of proof of identity, then it becomes meaningful.
Right.
I agree with Aya here because basically we're trying to come up with these heuristics in lieu of having like a richer like voter profile, right?
Yeah.
So if there's some kind of proof of identity or some kind of way for people to understand who the person is that's voting, or at least what their intentions may be, that will probably be helpful.
Does it solve it to make them sign a message saying what their objection is for each wallet that gets? Because I also feel like in reconciliation itself, there's an argument to be made that we should take into account people who object and people who tell us what their objection is and sign their objection.
I'm going to still point out that even signing an objection, taking the time to come up with different variations of saying the same thing is still so easy to Sybil attack that I don't know that it's really meaningful.
Well, and not only that, but if everyone has the same objection, we shouldn't force them to think of different words for it.
True that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's helpful. What about percentage of all tokens versus percentage of the tokens that are voted in a vote? That's, I think, a tough. Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think that is very tough. I think at least for now, we should be using a percentage of tokens that's voted, just because Rook kind of has a large percentage of the supply, yeah, I just think it makes sense to do a percentage of tokens that's voted.
Gotcha. Yeah,
could be
there's
wrong.
some
I'd
good
like someone to refute me.
Yeah, no. I think it's a good point, and I should have made it also clearer in the slide. This, when I say percent of tokens, I mean percent of votable tokens. So Stubbs has been working on getting us that data around what is a meaningful denominator for that percentage. So it shouldn't be all tokens everywhere. So that was badly stated on my part.
And that is one thing that we're kind of working on here, where it's like, okay, we've got a bunch of tokens that are in liquidity pools, that are on exchanges. It's really easy to look at the stuff that's like in the Treasury and say that is not eligible for voting. But a lot of these other sources that are kind of not in circulation at the moment, everything's so liquid. Like if you want to pull your liquidity, then suddenly you can use it, and we can look at who owns the liquidity, and we know that for at least Uniswap, Treasury has 85% of it. But deciding what's eligible and what's not, or just not including any of that. But we, luckily we've got the data, and we have been looking at who's actually voted on the different KIPs and things like that. So at the end of the day, though, it's gonna be a little bit. We're gonna have to make some arbitrary decisions of, what's excluded or not, and if it's 10% or 5% or whatever it is. But that's kind of what we're working on right now.
Cool.
So I'm not in strong favor of the percentage voted, but because you do a consent-based voting, I kind of feel like that kind of leans toward that direction. Because people who don't know enough or don't care enough or pay attention enough to vote are kind of saying, well, I'm going to go with what everybody else has decided in how the voting system's set up. And unless you made abstention explicit, in which case, thinking about it differently might make more sense. But I just feel like the way the voting system's designed is kind of biased towards saying, like, the people who really matter are the ones taking the time to actually vote.
Well,
having a sorry for interrupting.
No, go ahead.
A apply back where we implement a that so present with a empathy problem and unable to Quorum who may be unable to prop anything. And
yeah, that was bad.
Percent voting is a scalable set that is that problem. If you're one, the one that naturally deals with what your participants are.
Good call.
Well, and Jason, one thing that we had talked about, but it's kind of on the topic of if you've got a vote against, objection, no objection, and then if you kind of consent, that's a third option, but it doesn't actually get recorded. And I would almost argue that for the potentially it's either people are okay with it, they consent, they don't have strong opinions either way, and so they potentially don't bother voting at all, rather than maybe following the herd. But you could have 50% of the votable tokens of people saying I consent, and you wouldn't actually see that. So you could have then one wallet voting objection, and it looks like it's 10% of the vote, when in reality it's 1% of what people actually think, but a large majority is consenting. So I think that that's probably another thing that we need to look at, is whether we continue with like the consent as being something that's not recorded.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, the thinking behind the total votable tokens was along those lines as well, because you could imagine a case where only 10,000 tokens bother voting. Like if we set a quorum based on that, some percentage of that, then you get some vanishingly small number of people who could tip something. I don't know. I mean, our token counts have been getting better in terms of the amount voted, but still they represent such a small proportion. So my fear with setting a token quorum based on the number that vote is what happens if the number that vote is pretty small. Maybe we could set, I don't know. Is it ever done that people do a sliding quorum based on how many were voted? That seems really complicated.
Yeah, I've seen that sliding quorum used in a few different projects. I didn't really look into it too much. I just kind of noticed it when I was looking at their previous proposals, that the quorums for each might have been based on the importance of it. But I'll do some quick research. I might be posting stuff in the voice chat in a minute.
All right, yeah, well, lots to think about. Lots to think about. The well, this I think kind of pulls us naturally into the next part, which is we now have the ability to expand our voter set. So if people remember back a couple of months ago, we just started being able to allow people with XRook to vote. So that is relatively new, and thanks to the work of Rainfall and PyShow, we are now able to expand the voter set to people who are staking Rook with Sushi, with Uniswap, and with Bancor version 3. And we also are able to tune the weight that we give to XRook. So given the conversation today, I would love to get people's thoughts on where, at the moment that was set at 1. So the weight of one XRook is 1 Rook in voting, because that seems like something that we as a community should decide. So we're not going to decide that today, obviously, but I would love to get people's thoughts and get some feedback on that. Like, how should we be thinking as a community about weighting XRook versus Rook in voting?
So personally, unless we do some sort of lock, I think it should be 1-to-1. And that's my thought. Where I think potentially there should be tuning is with the liquidity provider tokens, and potentially like tune that down, since they're not actively like even holding it. They're they're almost asking to sell their stuff by providing liquidity.
That's a really good point. Rainfall, do you know if that's a tunable parameter in these strategies on Snapshot?
In a strategy for X Rook, we have a tunable parameter. So putting a higher weight on X Rook compared to Rook, that's totally possible.
Okay. And what about the strategies, the strategies that existed for Sushi and Uniswap and Bancor? Are those tunable or are they set? I should have looked.
From what I remember, they are not tunable. Of course, we could make new strategies for those. But what Paisho initially suggested was to keep that coefficient only for X Rook.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
So with the liquidity positions, you know, if you have 10 tokens for the uni LP position, it might be, you know, 100 Rook and 5 ETH. So does that just count the 100 Rook, or how does it get votes from that?
Yeah, it goes out and gets the Rook, I think.
Yeah, from what you know, it's only the Rook.
Yeah, it's an interesting suggestion though to lower the weight. I hadn't thought about that. What do other people think?
I'd like to see Rook holders have more weight than Rook holders. I think I had some emphasis on this earlier. Rook holders are kind of, you can really only assume that they're using the protocol in some way, whereas you kind of know that these X Rook holders are more involved. I would argue they have more at stake as well, and they made that commitment to give up that deposit fee, assuming it's there. But yeah, so I think X Rook should have a bigger stake, and I'd like to see, even though it might not be possible to give weights based on the time that you're staked, to kind of enhance that longer term commitment that I was talking about.
Because the way we have it now, since you don't have any lockup period, you know, 0.64% or whatever it is, it's something tiny. I think it just, if for some reason you don't have your Rook staked, it penalizes you, and it just encourages like gaming the system of, I'm going to stake the Rook and then pull it out, and it doesn't have really a penalty towards anyone who's trying to play this game, but it does reduce the vote for others, and you know, you're not required to stake. So I don't think that until there's more of a penalty and more of a hurdle and locking or something like that, it makes sense.
So I kind of hate to say it, but in the circumstances, I kind of agree with Stubbs, or if there is going to be a difference, that it should be relatively small. Like ideally, in my mind, it would be relatively large. And I think I expressed that in the server, but in the circumstances, without being able to look at time as well, I don't think it proves a lot. And I think recent behavior has shown that somebody's definitely willing to stake Rook just to have a more powerful looking vote.
Yeah.
If game of the is something that is the problem behavior, then change mechanism so that you can web that behavior protocol is likely to yield a super result. I don't know if that's something that you guys open your to, but it manifests of, instead of having just a locker mechanism, instead of lock they ban, and that gives the best way to fall because they do it down early, and so will end my value in the ecosystem on this. I think should carry a higher weight in that risk because they are forming a service protocol by accreting you that way, or perhaps the Treasury. We could pull a different, but that would allow you to have the lock mechanism and give that to those who are maligned with call, but allow for sort of gaming to have facilitated that turn negative equity into a positive.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, there are a lot of things we could do with staked rook that would be nice to think about. Does anybody know where, I should know this, but where we are in terms of working on that? Like, is that part of upcoming protocol changes, or is that something we need to figure out? And this is an open question for maybe Dietz or Tommy or anybody who would have a better window into that. Because I feel like a lot of these conversations we're having keep coming back to there are things we do for staking that would make it more optimal from a governance perspective, but it's not clear what's feasible.
So I don't think there's any work being done on it, or because we haven't made a decision here and done like a kit that says, hey, yeah, we want this. And so I don't think anything's being done on it, and I doubt anything will be done on it unless we say, like, this is how we want it to be done.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, I also think there's an extremely high opportunity cost of dead time, and their focus is on some other things. If we determine this is a high priority, then maybe there's an argument to be made there, especially maybe to bring in some kind of contractor. But I think it's just opportunity cost from the dev side at this point.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, maybe we could take a page from your book, Matt, and think about a working group or somebody like a set of people to have conversations about this.
Yeah, I mean, another option that may be a lower hanging fruit is just to identify what other kind of staking contracts there are and see if we can fork it, and then kind of see if how easily implementable it is into our current system. It may not be, because I know it can become complex, but maybe that's the lowest hanging fruit.
Sure.
One that
So what
comes
about
to mind is a slider bar for yield versus vote weight parameter, where that stake they can use the from the distributors who are partaking in return for in weight, and based off of on that slide, then the aggregate of the you get a weighting the way that divvies up locations.
Very cool.
I was going to say there are definitely communities that make putting your assets where your voting is something, at least for the proposer. I don't know, if anybody does that for the objector, but I think it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, maybe we'll look at that and we'll bring it back when we come back in 2 weeks, because it seems to be something we circle back to over and over again. It'd be nice to have some structure around it. Okay. Well, we will come back to that. Is there anybody else who hasn't had their say on this? Okay. Well, then moving on to the last thing we wanted to talk about today before we do open floor, if we have time, is thinking about expedited proposals. So these have come up in a couple of different contexts. I know Dietz has been pushing on this idea for a while, and so Wes, you were looking into some of these. Did you want to sort of summarize? And this is last minute, and we wanted to brainstorm with the community about it. So we're not bringing anything final here, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. So what I kind of found for Maker was that for their urgent kind of governance flow, really the entrant points to the governance was kind of like an urgent proposal, which would fall under another, we'll say KIP template, kind of outlining why is it urgent, or they have a position called a facilitator. So I guess the carryover here would be someone in your position, Jason, or similar, that's kind of always keep going on in the governance world. And they normally have like a weekly process for voting, but this emergency one kind of slims everything down to 24 hours, because it's probably time sensitive. So I'll share a quick flow chart in the voice chat as well. And actually, I'll just share, there's like a community document I just created within the last few minutes, where if anyone here has, sorry, okay, yeah, so I'll just share the document here where I really encourage earlier ideas here to just to gather some information.
great. Yeah, it seems like there are a couple of different cases where we could think about this, right? There's the urgent sort of emergency kind of KIP where something's going wrong and you need to move quickly. And then there's also almost the mirror image of that where something is tuning a parameter. And so that might be something that we wouldn't want to go through the whole entire process as well, but for kind of the opposite reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And then something just to note, there was an urgent maker proposal where a bad actor actually used a flash loan to manipulate their governance outcome. So that's just something to keep in mind, where these governance attacks are real and they are starting to happen.
Is that Dietz or Tommy or Matt? Is that something we've had to do in the past? It seems like we don't have a lot of precedent for this, which is good for sort of blue sky thinking, but it would be good to know if we've dealt with this before.
In terms of specifically a flash loan vote issue?
Or like an emergency issue or some kind of urgent thing that needed to go through.
I wouldn't say that we've had something like that happen, but there's always the potential where if somebody, say, wasn't doing white hat work, but they were doing some black hat work, and there was an issue with, I guess you'd think of the only user funds that we have, which is the the X-Rook staking contract. That would be something where, being able to modify that would be like an emergency situation. But I don't think that we've seen anything like that, no.
Got it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I know, for us to be able to implement some kind of situation or action like that is having the ability to understand what soft consensus is and mechanisms to allow us to effectively capture that. Because I think that's something that's fundamentally different, or not missing here.
Mm-hmm. Which is one of the things we were sort of talking about I can't remember, it was a few weeks ago we were talking about, oh yeah, that was right, the transition, excuse me, of something from a proposal on the forum to how it gets to the SOFONs, and we were talking about maybe using a forum poll or a non-binding snapshot vote. Is that something that would help with this, Matt, or is that I'm just trying to think of quick ways to get that kind of soft consensus.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the answers. I know there's probably a lot of like DAO tools out there that could allow it. But it's just about trying to assess each one of those. But yeah, I don't think I have the answer or even a
Yeah,
a
no,
lead.
no, I was just thinking out loud. So, all right, so maybe a way forward with this is to start thinking about use cases for how we might use it, and then we can refine from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think almost exclusively right now, most of those actions would probably fall under the Treasury. So I'm happy to kind of think of those situations. I guess outside of Treasury functions, I guess it would have to be. Actually, maybe that's it right now I can think of. Yeah.
And that is kind of the nice thing about being off-chain, right? Where the surface for these is reduced. All right, well, we will work a little more on that and bring something back. And that brings us to our last section, which is the open floor. So is there anything, any ideas people have or feedback or thoughts on the ecosystem in general, or let's talk governance? Or is it a hot Friday afternoon wherever you are? Who knows? Except it's Wednesday. Wow. I think I just gave away my week to people.
Yeah, and you missed my guffaws.
Yeah, it feels like Friday. I don't know why. I think because I went to the dentist this morning. That's a separate issue. All right. Stubbs, did you have something?
No, I was just gonna say I'm in the same boat. Last night I was like, I can't believe tomorrow's Friday already. And then I was like, huh, you idiot, it's Thursday. Wait, no, tomorrow's Wednesday. So yeah,
I feel much better.
You're fine.
Yeah. Something about this hot weather that just like takes you out of time. All right. Well, listen, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. This was actually super helpful, and especially about this quorum stuff. It's great to get that feedback and much more to think about. So unless there's anything else, we will reconvene in a couple of weeks, and we'll see you then.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks everybody for hopping in.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good meeting,
Thanks,
Jason.
Jason.
Great work, Jason. Thanks.